Hi, I'm William Henderson,
And I'm B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So this podcast is loosely affiliated with B. McGraw's website.
Which is the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
So instead of fake articles related to academic journals, what we do is we look at real articles related to certain topics that people talk a lot about online. So this episode, we're going to talk about agriculture, ag policy,
Big ag.
big ag. So let's
Maybe a
get
little
started.
small ag.
Um, so what are your kind of top level thoughts on this? Is this something people really talk about at all?
People do talk about like farm subsidies somewhat and agricultural policy. I think there's like some doomerism in agricultural policy that think like we're ruining the soil and whatnot, but also that it's something you can't get around because it would be so unpopular to take money away from our hardworking farmers who totally haven't completely automated all farms at this point. I don't know. I think a lot of people have a lot of cynical opinions about it, but not really a common, we should be doing this instead of this, other than I think there is some movement to do more sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, you do have environmentalists talk about sustainable agriculture. I haven't really looked into it, so I can't opine on it intelligently. But the big question mark whenever you talk about those types of things is like, does it affect output? I know organic agriculture has much less output. And so, we just can't switch to organic across the board because we just wouldn't grow enough food to feed everyone.
Yeah, without
But is there,
wildly increasing the price because it's more effort.
I mean, the big thing is fertilizer. Fertilizer just increases output so much that
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine not using it.
Big
there
time.
are like, it's like, okay, well, can you better manage, avoid depleting the soil, so there's the whole, like, every couple years, you just let the soil, is it called running fallow, where you just don't grow anything on it?
I'm not sure.
There's some term where you just rotate crops, or you use cover crops that kind of introduce nitrogen back into the soil. There's all that stuff, but like, I'm not a farmer, so I'm not gonna talk about that.
And then there's also, one piece of one topic kind of entered the like big ag versus a lot of small ag. I don't know if this applies to this podcast specifically, but some podcast was talking about the increase in price of eggs in America right now from the bird flu, and how it's not as bad in Canada, and evidently it's because American chicken farms are like much bigger than Canadian chicken farms, which are like, there are more of them, but they're smaller, so they're generally more expensive. But if you lose one to the bird flu, you don't lose like nearly as many chickens as you do here, which was kind of interesting.
There's different models of farming. I mean, there's plot size. There's like small, small farmers, and then there's big farmers. There's like, the most extreme state-controlled farming would be like collectivized farming that happened in the Soviet Union and China, which was a disaster because basically all the kulaks were, I think Stalin issued a decree to basically destroy the kulaks as a class. And the kulaks were basically farmers who owned larger parcels of land and had employees and stuff. So basically like the sort of petty bourgeoisie, but the sort of farmer equivalent of that. Yeah, so basically they just demanded that all the farms be turned over to the state, and then the kulaks all were like, I'd rather just kill all my animals than hand them over to the Soviet government. So they just, like, the kulaks just mass slaughtered, like, a large chunk, like I think over half of their livestock. And then once people started working for the farms, they just, stopped working hard because all their food was basically taken to be redistributed. And so people just stopped working hard. And so obviously it was a disaster and tens of millions of people died from famine. So that's like the obvious, that's like the extreme statist version of farming. And then there's like completely free market, zero subsidies, which is how it's done to a large extent in New Zealand. And then there's the subsidized version, which is kind of what happens in most countries, frankly, or a lot of countries. So there's a lot of different sort of versions of it. So basically, farm subsidies started during the New Deal era, at least in the United States. So there's all sorts of different, there's direct payments that, we'll go into more details. So basically, farmers started getting subsidies, mostly to kind of manage, what if prices drop like crazy, and farmers might go out of business because they can't raise enough money from, each bushel of wheat they sell or whatever.
Yeah.
So, there's all sorts of different reasons that happened. In terms of international comparisons, so there's a very interesting OECD white paper. When was this?
Is this what this plot is from?
Yeah, it's from 2022, so not too long ago.
Okay,
but it basically compares.
So on the lower end of, actually, introduce the graph first.
Yeah, so there's a graph. So the paper is called Develop Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation 2022, Reforming Agricultural Policies for Climate Change Mitigation. So the OECD is like an intergovernmental organization that's like mostly like the wealthy countries, but a few sort of, less wealthy countries like places like Colombia, but it's mostly like Europe, the US, etc. But they're basically like a technocratic organization that just like compares notes when it comes to like different policy things. So there's a graph that shows what percentage of gross farm receipts are, producer support, basically subsidies from the government. The US is actually not too high, which is kind of interesting. For some reason, I thought it would be higher, but it's about 10%. So about 10% of the revenue.
Pretty middle of the pack.
Yeah, so about 10% of the revenue that farmers get is basically from the government. Argentina's like negative 20, so I'm assuming that means they get taxed at a high rate.
I guess
I'm thinking like, why else would there be a negative number? So maybe that's just tax that they're taking.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. Is I'm assuming they're getting taxed.
Yeah,
looks like that's the case for
and
Vietnam and India as well.
New Zealand is kind of the poster child of the libertarian sort of zero government, well, not zero, but minimal government intervention in their sort of agriculture. I'm sure there's like regulations around food safety, whatever, but like in terms of direct subsidies, like pretty close to zero. So we'll talk about New Zealand, and they used to have subsidies. And then at the high end, so Iceland is at like almost 60% of farm revenue is government subsidies.
Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland are pretty top, and I imagine they're not that great to grow food in.
Yeah, Iceland and Norway, they're all mountainous, rocky places. Like Switzerland is very mountainous. Norway and Iceland are cold and quite mountainous and rocky. So they seem like very bad places to grow food in. Yeah. A lot of the places with high subsidies are like relatively not food insecure in the sense that people don't get food, but they're reliant on imports for food. So that's kind of interesting. So it seems like when there's a recognition that, food scarcity is a potential risk factor, you tend to see more subsidies.
Yeah, I believe that.
So that's very interesting. So in terms of the US, there's this CATO Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, but they're kind of hit and miss. There's things I like. I think they're relatively ideologically consistent, but also quite dogmatic about being libertarians, which I guess you'd kind of expect from a libertarian think tank. Mm-hmm. But they have an article called "Cutting Federal Farm Subsidies." This is from 2 years ago, but they basically talk. They're kind of arguing for why they believe they should be cut. But the paper cites essentially that over $30 billion a year of direct subsidies go to farms in the U.S. And from kind of researching on the internet, this seems to be the second highest subsidized industry after defense, which, if you count like every single defense contract as a subsidy, which is debatable because it's like, well, this is a public service. I mean,
Yeah.
technically, like if the government did not fund defense at all, like, I mean, I guess the industry wouldn't exist at all. Maybe you'd have some like mercenary armies or something, but like
It would exist, but in a very dystopian way.
yeah,
It would be
I would
like
say,
it is on what's that video game? Borderlands.
yeah, yeah. But basically, defense contracts are 70 to 80 billion dollars a year. Does that really count as a subsidy, or is that more, you know, private provisioning of a public service that the government contracts out?
I think it would
I
only
mean,
be a subsidy if they're like, we don't need you to make anything, but we need to keep the business afloat in case we need you.
that's fair. Yeah.
So it's in its own category, though, for sure.
Yeah. But basically, after that, farming is the top. And, per this Cato article, so most subsidies go to staple crops. So staple crops are sort of higher calorie, typically more carb rich, lower margin, crops.
Things
Whereas
that you
cash
can
crops,
store.
yeah, typically you can store for long periods of time. And cash crops are, like higher profit margin, spices, vegetables, fruits, usually less calorically dense, but usually they have more like vitamins and minerals and other nutrients.
So
And
if it
so,
goes on top of avocado toast, it's probably a cash crop.
yeah, probably.
Yeah. Here's one thing
So
that does get brought up a lot, actually, that I saw when I was looking at this. A
the
lot of
debate between,
people, a lot of people trash. Why do we have so many corn subsidies, especially when like half of it goes into making ethanol?
right. So staple crop, so basically like policy has kind of decided to subsidize a certain subset of agriculture, being mostly staple crops, mostly grains, things like corn, soybeans, etc., and less so cash crops and livestock. So about a third of farmers receive subsidies, which is less than I thought.
Yeah, I figured it'd be
And
way more.
yeah, larger farms tend to get more subsidies. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they just know how to kind of manage the system.
It's probably bargaining power.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah, or like they're able to afford like the expertise to get those subsidies, while like a small farm, like it's a lot more effort to figure
Yeah.
out how to do it. I don't know.
And as I mentioned before, about 10.6% of revenue is direct subsidies.
Hmm.
So there's a
Yeah,
couple.
that's lower than I thought it would be.
Yeah. So there's a couple like the big thing that really, the big law that subsidizes agriculture is the Farm Bill. And it gets renewed every couple of years. I don't remember the exact cadence, but this isn't like one of those, it was passed 100 years ago and it still exists today. It's something that's like renewed on a relatively regular basis.
It's
But
like
there's a
the
couple.
whatever infrastructure bill that almost every administration starts with.
I don't think infrastructure bills are really, those are less regular. I think those are kind of one-offs usually.
Really, I feel like they're all the
I
time.
think so. So there's a couple different sections of the Farm Bill. I don't know how much detail I'm going to go into, but there's so there's Title 1 of the Farm Bill, which is, actually I labeled two of them as Title 1. Anyways, I'll just go by their names. So there's the commodity programs. So basically, there's price loss coverage. So that means if average crop prices go below a certain point, farmers get direct payments. Agricultural risk coverage, ARC, which is direct payments when actual revenue falls below a guaranteed level. And then there's marketing assistance loans. So if prices are too low, you can basically get a loan so that you can like cover your expenses and then like sell your product later when prices are higher. And then there's the loan deficiency payments, LDPs, which is payments made to eligible people who decide not to take the loan. So various forms of like we'll cover for you if crop prices get too low, essentially.
So it's kind of like
Um,
futures, except the government doesn't really get that much out of it.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
then,
yeah.
well, futures are essentially a form of insurance. So you buy, futures and options, but usually futures in the case of, farm commodities. But basically, you're betting on the price of a commodity being a certain level, and then if it falls below that, and you're either long or short the future. I don't know which. I can't do finance math on the fly, but basically, if the price goes down, your financial instrument goes up. So it's like a form of insurance essentially to cover for. And then there's crop insurance. So, if there's weather, if yields are low, etc., prices drop, there's government insurance that covers that. There's a number of conservation programs, which, there's like a conservation reserve program, subsidies to convert erodible acreage to vegetative cover, environmental quality incentive programs, conservation stewardship programs. So basically, the government helps pay for various forms of conservation.
I remember there was a segment of this on that one show, Clarkson's Farm, where he did one of these things.
Yeah, there's a lot of these types of programs exist in a lot of countries. The particulars are quite different. Like I think in certain parts of Europe, like I think in places like France, there's a big focus on like maintaining the sort of cultural cachet of like the small, rustic vineyards of southern France or whatever. Like, maintaining that sort of tourist friendly sort of environment. Whereas the US system seems to lead to very large agribusinesses, essentially. So there's like different forms of it, but they're mostly all subsidized. There's disaster assistance programs, like the livestock indemnity program. All this data is from the USDA, which is, mostly the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture. The livestock indemnity program, I think, helps cover if you lose livestock for some reason or another. It helps kind of cover those expenses. There's the emergency
life
assistance
insurance for cows.
Yeah. And then there's emergency assistance for livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish, which is a very specific set of things.
Yeah. Honeybees are important.
Here's a good example from the livestock indemnity program. So covers livestock deaths in excess of normal mortality, because obviously all livestock
some are going to die,
caused by adverse weather or animal attacks, reintroduced into the wild by the federal government. So if like they reintroduce wolves and they get attacked, that type of thing. So these cover 75% of the fair market value of the livestock. So, and then, like I said, there's the livestock, honeybees, farm-raised fish one, non-insured crop disaster assistance. So various forms of disaster, unforeseen events. There's the specialty crop and organic farming support, which is kind of the rare thing focused on more kind of cash crops. And then there's the Rural Energy for America program, which includes, biofuel and renewable energy support.
Yeah, that's one of the criticisms of why are we subsidizing corn so much?
So there is like, a big question mark was like, is sort of ethanol based fuel. So that's like, corn basically going into gasoline, right? Is that actually better for the environment? And it seems like kind of,
is it
maybe.
Even? I think it's more like whenever we run out of oil, that's going to be an option for things that electrification doesn't work for.
So, yeah, I mean, that's potentially a reason why. But I think what you kind of see is like there's a lot of these subsidized crops kind of flow into like other products you would not expect them to. Like the percentage of of corn that is actually consumed by people directly, like eating corn on the cob, is like
It's pretty
is
low.
like not. It's actually surprisingly low.
It's mostly like corn syrup and what else do you eat? Cornbread.
Animal feed.
Oh, right. That's right.
Yeah, a lot of it is used to feed animals.
I hear that's what the soybean market's about too.
Yeah, and a lot of it goes into exports. There's huge export markets for these crops, which is incidentally why farmers don't like tariffs, is because they're huge exporters. So
yeah, so then when they get counter tariff,
yeah, so and then a lot of corn goes into fuel, etc. So corn syrup, a lot of sweetened foods. In fact, I believe one of the big reasons why Coke in the U.S. I think still uses corn syrup, whereas in Mexico uses sugar. So there are import tariffs and quotas on sugar, and there's huge subsidies for corn. So I mean that's literally why that's the case.
Yeah.
So outside of the Farm Bill, so those were all like mostly Farm Bill related things. There's other forms of subsidies. So there's market controls. So there's tariff rate quotas. So basically, the way tariff rate quotas work is, above, it's like, okay, like a certain amount of these different crops can enter the U.S. without tariffs. And then once we reach that limit, then everything above that gets tariffed. And there's like there's this thing from the WTO. It says the United States of America, Part A1, tariffs and imports. And so there's basically an entire set of agreements of like, what are the different rates? And I mean, that's what the WTO is. It's a forum for agreeing on these rates. But basically we have import quotas and then thereafter tariffs on tobacco, peanuts, dairy, sugar, cotton, beef, sugar-containing products, etc. A large number of these are exempted under the USMCA agreement, which is the last free trade agreement we've had with the US and Mexico. So a lot of these, so currently, who knows if this will change, but for the time being, most of these do not apply to US and Mexican products. But if it's like something from like, Jamaica or the Bahamas or, other nations, island nations close to the US, etc., they probably have to pay these tariffs.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, a lot of these, like the domestic sugar, because there are like sugar cane farms in like Florida and stuff, but like
I guess they're south enough for that.
But there's like not that many of there's not that much of it. So it's a tariff that exists.
We're not the right environment for it. I guess you could potentially in Hawaii.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like it's a tariff that exists to like protect a very small market, a very small industry of like producers, which is interesting. There are export subsidies, but they're mostly promotional. So it's mostly like the government helps pay for like marketing and stuff like that. And like, like, hey, please buy our stuff. So there's the market access program and the foreign market development. So it's all about like, hey, how can we help look for export markets to sell our stuff to?
We just put basically billboards out there of the food pyramid, right?
Yeah, the food pyramid. So basically, what are farm subsidies in the U.S.? It's a mix of direct payments when prices are low, various forms of insurance, and tariffs, and some export support. So pretty straightforward, Comparison to other models. So the most obvious is New Zealand. So there's another CATO article. So this article is from 2023 as well. It's New Zealand's free market farming. But basically in the 1980s, was it the 1980s or it was in 1984, New Zealand removed almost all farm subsidies in their country.
What was the level they were at beforehand?
So this graph shows farm receipts subsidies as a percent of receipts. And so in 1986, it was 20% in New Zealand.
Oh, I see that.
At the same time in the US, it was about 22, 23%. So both countries had very similar levels. And then basically the New Zealand went cold turkey and removed all subsidies, which I'm surprised that they were able to pull that off, politically speaking. Maybe they had like a proportional representation system where, you know, farmers were not as big of a constituency. Because in the US, farm states have an overwhelming political power at the federal level.
They do.
Because, I mean, how many farm states with tiny populations are there that have 2 senators? You know, like there's several states that have, like, I think the Dakotas.
So that's kind of one of the, I don't know if it's a circle jerk argument or the truth about like, oh, farm subsidies are, you know, you can't get rid of them politically because it's, you know, political suicide because they're just so overrepresentative because of, you know, whatever, electoral college,
right,
senatorial representation, whatever. But then I also wonder, like, is it more of just a way to keep prices low for people so that like more people will do farming by making it not risky to be a farmer? Like how expensive and uncertain would food prices be without subsidies?
Well, it's a good question about the food prices. I mean, you would expect. Well, it's a good question. So I think basically when you subsidize an industry, it increases the supply of the overall production of that industry beyond what it normally would have without subsidies. And in the US, you know, we have, probably produce more farm products than, you know, more crops than we would otherwise without subsidies. Crops, I mean, staple crops tend to be a global commodity. You know, obviously there's like transportation costs when you move from one part of the world to another, but generally speaking, like, I think most of those commodities tend to have relatively similar prices across the world. So I kind of wonder, like, it would probably increase. It's hard to say for sure.
Well, there's the only way the prices would be the same across the world, more or less, would be, you know, just because it's a global market. So,
right,
something's pricier over on one side of the world, then you're going to ship it out there until it balances out.
Right. So what would most likely happen is like it would probably reduce the export market, because that would be the number one thing to kind of, you know, it costs more to ship things to other countries. So it would probably, the first thing that would get hit is probably the export market, and then probably things like, you know, putting corn into fuel, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, to what degree would the actual, you know, supply demand mismatch actually change because it seems like we produce a lot of stuff that goes into other industries, that goes not industries, but into other products beyond just human food. So, you know, there's export markets, and then there's like feed, which I guess influences the price of meat. But then there's also, you know, the fuel, you know, like fuel for gasoline. But then if you remove, you know, ethanol from fuel, would that increase the price of gasoline also? So that's a complicated question I don't know the answer to, but it might be safe to assume, you know, maybe food prices would probably rise a little bit if we remove subsidies.
Probably would be. I don't know how much more it would rise, but I don't think it would 10%, be that 10% number.
Yeah, would it be?
I doubt it would be that 10% number, but it would be something.
It would be something. So that was part 1 of our episode on agriculture policy. We'll do part 2 next.